The sky above northern France was a sheet of white fire, the sun bleeding through thin clouds like a torch behind glass. It was June 1943, and the roar of engines filled the heavens. American bombers, Silver P-17 flying fortresses, drifted east in perfect formation, their bellies heavy with bombs meant for German factories. The air trembled under their slow, rhythmic thunder. Inside the formation, the crews worked in tense silence, watching the contrails twist behind them like pale scars across the sky. They knew what was coming. The Germans always came. Far ahead, dots began to appear, tiny, black specks against the horizon. Fighters. The alarm ran down the intercoms, bandits, 12 o'clock high. The gunners swung their turrets, eyes squinting against the glare. Somewhere to the west, a group of escort fighters dived out of the clouds, engines howling like angry beasts. They were new machines, thick-bodied, barrel-winged, and loud. To many, they looked too big, too clumsy to dance with the thin-winged Focke-Wulf streaking in to attack. German pilots often laughed when they first saw them, calling them milk bottles with wings. But when one of those American fighters rolled over and unleashed its 8.50 caliber Brownings, the laughter stopped. The guns spat molten metal, their tracer lines tearing through the sky. A single FW-190 exploded mid-turn, a black blossom of smoke and flame. The sound of that first kill echoed across the clouds like a warning. The war in the air was about to change forever. Only a year earlier, the skies of Europe had belonged almost entirely to the Luftwaffe. The Germans had built their air arm into a weapon of precision and terror. Their pilots were seasoned from years of combat in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. They knew how to strike fast and vanish before their prey could react. Against them, the United States Army Air Forces were still finding their footing. The 8th Air Force, newly established in England, was throwing waves of bombers across the Channel in daylight raids, an audacious decision when everyone else flew under cover of night. The theory was simple: daylight bombing could hit precision targets. The reality was brutal. Without long-range escorts, the bombers were easy prey. The Luftwaffe carved through them, sending dozens of fortresses down in flames with every raid. Crews counted the empty bunks each morning and realized how fragile daylight dominance truly was. By 1942, it was clear, the Allies needed a new kind of fighter, one that could climb higher, dive faster, and survive the punishing realities of combat over Europe. Republic Aviation, a relatively small manufacturer in Farmingdale, New York, had already been experimenting with a powerful radial engine design. Its engineer, Alexander Kartveli, was a visionary, a man who believed in strength over elegance. While others designed sleek, streamlined fighters, Kartveli built a machine that looked more like a battering ram than a blade. The result was the P-47 Thunderbolt, a single-seat fighter unlike anything the world had seen. It was immense, weighing more than 5 tons fully loaded. Its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine was so massive that the nose seemed to swallow the cockpit. A complex turbo-supercharger system ran through the fuselage like veins of metal, giving the plane unmatched power at high altitudes. It was, in every sense, an airborne tank. When the first Thunderbolts reached England in early 1943, pilots laughed almost as loudly as their German counterparts. They had asked for a nimble escort. Instead, they received a monster that shook the ground when it taxied. Pilots joked that it was a 7-ton milk jug with a propeller. The name stuck, Jug. But when they took it up, they discovered something extraordinary. It could climb to 30,000 feet with ease. It could dive like a stone, hitting speeds that snapped wings off lighter planes. And when its 8 Browning machine guns opened up, it unleashed a wall of fire unlike anything else in the sky. Each gun fired 800 rounds per minute, and together they could pour half a ton of lead into a target in under 20 seconds. One burst could disintegrate a fighter, a few seconds more could rip the wings off a bomber. Still, no one knew if it could survive real combat. The first missions exposed its flaws. It burned fuel too quickly, giving it limited range. Its climb rate was slow at low altitudes, and in tight turns it felt heavy. Many doubted it could ever protect bombers deep over Germany. Yet the men who flew it began to see its true character. It was almost impossible to kill. Pilots came back with half their control surfaces shot away, engines coughing black smoke, holes big enough to stick a head through. The Jug simply refused to die. One ace, Robert Johnson, once counted more than 200 bullet holes in his aircraft after a fight. A German ace had emptied his entire magazine trying to finish him off. Johnson limped home, bloodied but alive. When he landed, the crew chief kissed the wing. "She's ugly," he said, "but she's mean." The Thunderbolt story was, in many ways, America's industrial story in miniature. Where the Luftwaffe relied on finesse and discipline, the United States built brute strength and reliability. The R-2800 engine was the same one powering the Navy's Corsairs and Hellcats. Factories across the country turned out thousands of engines, propellers, and parts each month. What the P-47 lacked in elegance, it made up for in sheer numbers and durability. The airframe was built of thick aluminum, and every critical line was armored or redundant. Its cockpit was surrounded by heavy plating, giving pilots a sense of invincibility rare in that era. And unlike inline-engine fighters, its radial could take hits without bleeding coolant, a single-engine fighter's death sentence. That one design choice would save countless lives. By the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force had begun integrating P-47 groups into their daylight raids. The first were the 4th, 56th, and 78th Fighter Groups, flying from muddy airstrips scattered across England. Their mission was clear: protect the bombers as far as fuel would allow, then turn back. It was thankless work. They knew that when they reached the edge of their range, the bombers would continue alone into Germany, and often never return. Still, with every mission, the Jug's reputation grew. German pilots learned to respect its dives. They called it the Sturmbochter, the battering ram fighter. "You cannot follow it down," one Luftwaffe report warned, "or you will die." Behind the front lines, engineers worked to extend the Jug's reach. Drop tanks, external fuel canisters mounted under the wings, were the answer. With them, the P-47 could escort bombers deeper into enemy territory. It still couldn't reach Berlin, that would come later, but it could now protect the bombers over France, the Low Countries, and Western Germany. The psychological impact was immense. For the first time, American crews felt that someone was watching their backs. The air battles of late 1943 turned the Jug from a joke into a legend. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a double strike against the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and the aircraft factories at Regensburg. It was one of the largest and bloodiest raids of the war. Hundreds of B-17s thundered toward their targets. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had: Bf-109s, FW-190s, twin-engine Zerstorers. The sky over Germany became a churning cauldron of fire and contrails. For hours, fighters and bombers clashed in brutal close-range combat. When the Thunderbolts arrived to cover the withdrawal, they tore into the enemy lines with savage precision. Their heavy guns shredded German formations that had already spent their ammunition attacking bombers. Pilots described the air as filled with falling debris, burning engines, wings, and parachutes trailing smoke. It was the kind of chaos that made or broke reputations. When the day was over, the bombers had lost 60 aircraft, but the Luftwaffe had lost more. The Thunderbolt had proven it could stand in the storm. Among those who flew that day was Francis "Gabi" Gabreski, a Polish-American pilot whose cool precision would make him one of the top American aces. Gabreski loved the Jug. He called it the perfect airplane for fighting a German. To him, the Thunderbolt's weight wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. He learned to use its dive to ambush opponents, striking from above and rolling away before they could respond. His philosophy was simple: hit fast, hit hard, and never linger. "If you try to turn with a 190, you'll die," he told younger pilots. "But if you make him follow you down, he'll tear his wings off." The Jug turned the sky into a place of brutal arithmetic, speed, altitude, and firepower, replacing the romantic image of chivalrous dogfights. Each mission added new stories to the growing legend. Pilots who once doubted the Jug now swore by it. They returned to base with bullet-riddled wings, smoking engines, and grins that only survivors know. Maintenance crews worked through the nights, patching holes and changing engines under flickering lamps. In those English fields, the Thunderbolt became more than an airplane, it became a lifeline. As autumn 1943 deepened, so did the Allied offensive. Bomber formations struck at marshalling yards, aircraft plants, and oil depots. The Thunderbolts flew ahead, sweeping the skies clean. The Luftwaffe began to feel the pressure. Its veteran aces were dying faster than they could be replaced, and fuel shortages were creeping in. Meanwhile, American factories back home were producing fighters at a rate that defied comprehension. What Germany lost in 1 week of combat, the US could replace in a day. For the first time since 1939, the balance of power in the air began to tilt. And as the winter storms rolled in over Europe, the Germans who once mocked the Thunderbolt learned to fear its sound, the deep, guttural roar of the R-2800 approaching through the clouds. It was no longer a joke. It was thunder made metal. The cold air above the English countryside carried the low thunder of engines warming before dawn. It was early 1944, and the tide of the air war was finally beginning to turn. The Thunderbolt had matured, its pilots had learned its language, and the Luftwaffe, once the masters of Europe's skies, were bleeding. At airfields from Debden to Halesworth, American ground crews worked through the night, their hands numb and blackened with grease, refueling, rearming, and inspecting bullet-pocked fuselages. Inside the ready rooms, pilots sat hunched over steaming cups of coffee, flight jackets pulled tight against the cold. They studied maps and target photos, listening to briefings that always ended the same way: "Gentlemen, bring them back alive." Outside, the jugs waited in long rows, silver skins streaked with oil, their canopies fogged by frost. Each one carried 8.50 caliber guns, now synchronized to fire within a convergence point just ahead of the propeller. When those guns spoke, they spoke in unison, 8 tongues of flame that could cut through armor and flesh alike. For every German pilot who once laughed at the Thunderbolt's shape, there were now dozens who whispered about its sting. As daylight crept across the fields, the first squadrons lifted off, heavy with drop tanks slung beneath their wings. Their engines thundered in deep unison, the sound echoing across the countryside like a rolling storm. These weren't the short-range interceptors of 1943 anymore. The engineers at Republic had pushed the Thunderbolt to its limits, adding external fuel and improved superchargers that allowed it to follow bombers deep into enemy skies. The Jug had finally found its stride. The first German formations met them over the channel. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts streaked in from the east, sleek and deadly, banking into the attack with practiced precision. For years, this had been their hunting ground. But today, something was different. The P-47s didn't evade. They climbed straight into the sun, turned, and came diving back down. Their engines screamed as gravity added speed. The Germans tried to follow, but as they did, the P-47 simply disappeared into the dive, reaching speeds over 500 miles per hour. Luftwaffe pilots learned the hard way that no man could outdive a Jug and live to tell about it. A German veteran later described it simply: "We saw them as elephants trying to dance. Then we realized they were hammers falling from heaven." The tactical doctrine of the Thunderbolt was unlike anything the Luftwaffe had faced. The Americans called it boom and zoom. There was no swirling dogfight, no elegant ballet of turns. The Jug hit once, hard, and was gone. It fought with weight, altitude, and firepower. The 8 Brownings fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds, each bullet capable of tearing through engine blocks or fuel tanks. Pilots often described the sensation as unleashing a physical wall of metal, the recoil shaking the aircraft like a living creature. German fighters caught in its crosshairs had seconds to live. The 56th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Hubert Zemke, perfected this brutal style. Zemke, a brilliant tactician and fierce leader, understood that the Jug's advantage wasn't in finesse but in force. He drilled his men relentlessly, teaching them to strike in coordinated slashing attacks. "We will fight on our terms," he told them. Not theirs. Under his command, the group became a legend. Pilots like Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and Dave Schilling turned the Thunderbolt into an executioner's blade. Their kill counts climbed, and their confidence with it. By spring 1944, the 8th Air Force's escort missions were pushing farther east. The P-47s now ranged as far as Berlin and Leipzig, thanks to larger fuel tanks and better navigation. Each raid was part of a larger campaign, Operation Argument, known to the crews as Big Week. For 7 days, Allied bombers hammered Germany's aircraft industry, while the fighters hunted anything that took off to stop them. The Luftwaffe had no choice but to rise and fight. When they did, the Jug was waiting. Over the skies of central Germany, hundreds of contrails streaked in every direction, each one marking a deadly duel. Pilots recalled the chaos, flak bursting below, tracer fire arcing through the sun, and the crack of radios filled with calls for help. The Thunderbolt pilots dove again and again, guns flashing. One after another, German fighters spiraled into the ground, their wreckage littering fields and forests. The Luftwaffe's losses that week were catastrophic. Their veteran corps, once the envy of the world, was decimated. The Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible, air superiority over the Reich itself. But victory came at a cost. Each mission pushed men and machines to their limits. Pilots spent hours in the cramped cockpit, oxygen masks freezing over, hands numb from the cold. At 30,000 feet, even breathing felt like work. Many Thunderbolts returned home pockmarked by shrapnel or trailing smoke, engines barely holding together. Some didn't return at all. For every pilot who landed, another vanished into the gray waters of the Channel or the forests of Germany. War in the air was personal, immediate, and unforgiving. The Jug, however, earned its reputation as the plane that brought its pilots home. Robert S. Johnson's story became the stuff of legend. On June 26, 1943, while escorting bombers near Lille, his P-47 was hit repeatedly by German fire. The canopy was jammed, oil sprayed across his goggles, and flames licked around his legs. A Luftwaffe ace closed in behind him and emptied his guns at point-blank range. When Johnson's plane didn't fall, the Germans circled, saluted, and flew away, out of ammunition. Somehow, the Jug stayed in the air. Johnson coaxed it across the Channel, landing battered but alive. Mechanics counted 21 cannon shell holes in the fuselage. The engine had lost half its cylinders. Yet it had carried him home. That kind of toughness became a legend in itself. Pilots trusted the Jug like they trusted their own hands. They knew it could dive through fire, take punishment, and still climb for home. It gave them courage. And courage changed the war. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe's decline was visible everywhere. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons, maintenance lagged, and the once proud German fighter arm was stretched thin. New pilots arrived with barely a dozen hours of combat training. They were thrown into battles against American aces who had survived 100 missions. It was a slaughter. The sky that once belonged to the Germans now echoed with the roar of American engines. In June 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Thunderbolt took on a new role, destroyer of the ground. No longer limited to escort duty, it became the hammer that crushed German logistics. The Jug's thick armor and massive payload turned it into one of the most effective fighter bombers of the war. Pilots loaded 500-pound bombs under each wing, along with rockets and external fuel. They dove into the maelstrom of Normandy, strafing convoys, blasting tanks, and cutting rail lines. The Luftwaffe barely appeared anymore. The few German aircraft that did rise were quickly swept aside. The Normandy campaign marked a transformation. The P-47 was no longer just a guardian of the bombers, it was now the sword of the battlefield. Troops on the ground came to recognize its deep, throaty engine note long before they saw it. That sound, one soldier said, meant salvation. In the hedgerows of France, the Jug became infamous among German troops. Columns of trucks would scatter the moment its engine growled overhead. A single pass could turn an armored vehicle into a flaming wreck. Pilots strafed trains until they exploded in waves of fire. One report described a P-47 attack that wiped out an entire panzer column in minutes. For the Germans, the sky itself had become an enemy. The transition from air duels to ground assault suited the Jug perfectly. It could take hits from anti-aircraft fire that would have shredded other planes. Its rugged radial engine rarely caught fire. Even when riddled with flak, it brought pilots home. The 362nd Fighter Group, operating from newly captured airfields in France, became one of the most feared units in the European theater. They flew low, fast, and merciless. If it moved, one pilot said, "We killed it." For the Luftwaffe, the war had turned into a nightmare. Their airfields were bombed before takeoff, their fuel depots burned, and their once proud fighters were now hunted prey. The P-47 had become the face of Allied air power, massive, relentless, and unyielding. By the time Allied forces reached the German border, the Thunderbolt was operating almost constantly. Some pilots flew 3 or 4 sorties a day. They struck bridges, tanks, and communication lines, grinding down the German war machine bit by bit. Every destroyed train meant fewer supplies at the front. Every burning convoy meant another day of chaos behind enemy lines. The airmen began to notice something eerie. There were fewer and fewer enemy fighters to meet them. The Luftwaffe was dying, not in one dramatic battle, but in 1,000 small ones. Each dogfight, each raid, each strafing run chipped away at what had once been Germany's greatest strength. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe could no longer defend its own homeland. The Jug had done more than just kill planes, it had crushed a legend. The same German pilots who once mocked it now whispered about it in fear. When they saw its silhouette glinting in the sun, they broke off their attacks. And when they didn't, they paid with their lives. But the Thunderbolt's greatest triumph was yet to come. As the Allies prepared to cross the Rhine and push into the heart of Germany, the Jug would once again take center stage, this time as both sword and shield. It would clear the skies above the advancing armies, destroy what was left of Germany's railways, and carry the fight to the last corner of the Reich. And as it did, the sound of its 8 Brownings would echo over Europe like rolling thunder, the sound of a war that was finally turning toward victory. By late 1944, the skies over Europe had changed beyond recognition. The once formidable Luftwaffe was fighting for breath, its resources drained, its veterans gone. In their place came frightened boys in new uniforms, flying hastily assembled planes with barely any training. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolt ruled above like an unrelenting storm. Its pilots flew with practiced precision, their missions no longer duels but exterminations, systematic, mechanical, devastating. From low over the Rhine to the deep industrial heartlands of Germany, the Jug became an omnipresent sound. Villagers learned to fear that thunderous growl that began as a hum and built to a scream. It meant that somewhere nearby, German steel would melt, or German fuel would burn. Bridges vanished beneath its bombs. Locomotives exploded in sheets of flame. In the final winter of the war, the P-47s shattered the last fragments of German mobility. The Luftwaffe could no longer defend its skies, and the Wehrmacht could no longer move beneath them. Each sortie carried new dangers. The flak over Germany was merciless, thousands of black puffs marking the air like wounds. Pilots often described the sensation as flying through an invisible minefield. A single hit could rip a wing apart, or tear through the cockpit. Yet the Jug's durability remained legendary. There were reports of Thunderbolts returning with tails shredded, cylinders blown out, entire control cables severed, and still managing to land. One pilot joked, "You don't fly the Jug home. You point it, and it takes care of the rest." In December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge erupted in the snow-covered Ardennes, the P-47s found themselves in their most desperate test yet. The German counterattack caught the Allies off guard, and weather-grounded the air forces for days. Allied troops fought surrounded and isolated, with armor and supply lines cut. Then, on December 23, the skies cleared. Within hours, the Thunderbolts were airborne. What followed was an onslaught unmatched in the war's history. They struck German convoys as they wound through narrow forest roads, turning entire columns into blazing infernos. Pilots attacked at treetop level, engines roaring, shells hammering. It was like hunting in a barrel, one recalled. They couldn't move, and we couldn't miss. Within 48 hours, hundreds of German vehicles lay destroyed. The Luftwaffe tried to intervene, but the few planes that rose were met with swarms of P-47s. The air belonged to the Allies again. The Bulge would collapse, in large part, because the Thunderbolt refused to let the German army breathe. By early 1945, the end was visible on the horizon. The Jug continued to pound the crumbling Reich. It strafed trains evacuating troops, bombed bridges across the Rhine, and destroyed the last remnants of the Luftwaffe's once mighty infrastructure. Each day, the Allied advance pushed deeper, and each night, the roar of Thunderbolts filled the airfields of Belgium and France. For many pilots, the mission had become routine, an endless rhythm of takeoff, strike, return, refuel, repeat. But for others, there was a growing sense of reflection. They understood now what they represented, not just victory, but vengeance, precision, and persistence. The German populace, once accustomed to dominance, now looked skyward with dread. Even when the sound was distant, it filled the imagination with terror. The laughing Jug that the Luftwaffe once mocked had become a symbol of inevitability, an unstoppable force of American industry and resolve. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Thunderbolt's work was done. It had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties in the European theater alone, dropping over 130,000 tons of bombs and firing hundreds of millions of rounds. It had destroyed nearly 9,000 enemy aircraft, tens of thousands of vehicles, and helped ensure that the Allies owned the sky. For every pilot who once doubted it, there were now hundreds who owed it their lives. But the story of the Thunderbolt didn't end in Europe. Across the vast Pacific, another war was still raging, one fought across jungles, islands, and oceans. The P-47 had been deployed there as well, replacing older aircraft in the 5th Air Force. Its sheer range and power made it invaluable in striking Japanese positions scattered across the Pacific. Pilots who flew it in the tropics described its personality differently. It was like a bison on wings, one said. Slow to start, unstoppable once it charged. In the Pacific, the Jug faced new challenges: heat, humidity, and vast distances. Yet it performed with the same brutal reliability. Over New Guinea, the Philippines, and Burma, it proved lethal against Japanese shipping and ground targets. Its 8 Brownings shredded convoys and barges. Its armor allowed pilots to dive low into enemy fire and still escape. In some campaigns, the P-47 destroyed more Japanese supplies than entire naval task forces. As 1945 wore on, the Thunderbolt took part in the final strikes against Japan itself. From Iwo Jima, it escorted B-29 bombers on long-range missions and attacked airfields that could threaten them. Though the war ended before it could join the invasion of the Japanese home islands, the Jug had already carved its name into both theaters of war. It was, in every sense, the American warplane, massive, rugged, and relentless. When peace finally came, many pilots found it difficult to let go. The war had made them legends, but it had also made them weary. They had seen too many empty chairs in the mess halls, too many names scratched off rosters. The Jug had brought them home again and again, and now, as the world exhaled after years of violence, they felt a strange gratitude toward the machine that had carried them through hell. In the years after the war, the Thunderbolt faded quietly into history. New jet engines made its propeller seem primitive. Its final combat missions came in Korea and Latin America. Yet among those who flew it, the respect never vanished. At reunions and air shows, gray-haired men would still reach out to touch the metal skin of the few surviving Jugs, their eyes misting with memory. "She was heavy," one veteran said softly. "But she was on our side." Today, the P-47 stands as a symbol of American engineering at its purest, not elegant, not beautiful, but brutally effective. It embodied the industrial strength that defined the Allied war effort: massive factories, endless supply lines, and a spirit that refused to break. Where the Germans built precision, the Americans built endurance. And endurance won the war. In retrospect, the laughter of those early Luftwaffe pilots feels almost tragic. They mocked what they didn't yet understand. They saw only the Jug's size, its weight, its awkwardness. They didn't see the heart inside it, the unyielding roar that would one day echo across the skies of Europe and signal their own defeat. When historians look back on World War II, the Thunderbolt often stands in the shadow of sleeker legends like the Mustang or the Spitfire. But the truth is simpler: without the P-47, the Allies might never have gained the control of the skies they needed to win. It was the bridge between survival and supremacy, between defense and domination. And perhaps that's why, even decades later, the sound of its radial engine, that deep, rolling growl, still sends a shiver down the spine of those who know what it meant. It was the sound of 8 Brownings tearing through the air, the sound of courage under fire, the sound of an empire's fall. The German pilots who once laughed at it learned the hard way: there was nothing funny about a Thunderbolt in a dive. It was, and will forever remain, the Jug, the beast that ruled the skies with thunder and steel.